I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm going to be looking at Matt Ehret and James Corbett, Battle of the Geopolitical Brains. First, I'm going to look at where they agree, which I think is really important, and then where they differ in terms of their ideology. And then I'll be looking at where I agree or differ with each of them. So there is a lot to cover here. Let's get started. Let's start with where they agree. The history of World War I and World War II, the true deep history, I can count on two fingers the journalists who are doing a deep dive into that. And they are these two. It is a critically important history, and the more that I get into it, the more I realize that all of the things that we're looking at right now have been set up by that history. So I think that both of these journalists are people that we need to keep paying attention to, because there's just not a lot of sources for this story, and we need all the information that we can get. They also agree on the Great Reset, the history of the eugenics program and how that's being played out today, and the insanity of these vaccine mandates and all the things that have been inflicted on us over the last 3 years. Where I would say, in the broadest terms, they diverge is that I think that Matt would agree that he's a centrist, that he sees the only way to be able to push back against the Great Reset through large nations. And so he, having a history with China, being a professor at the American University at Moscow, he believes that this convergence between Russia and China is a very good thing because of the development that it's leading to, and that all of the interest that China has in third world countries and the things that it's doing to invest are things that are benevolent and will be good for the people who live there. James, on the other hand, is a decentralist. He describes himself as having started out as a libertarian and then becoming an anarchist. So I think he is perhaps the most ideologically consistent anarchist or decentralist that I've ever seen. It's the lens through which he looks at every topic that he covers. That, of course, is my bias also. The topic of my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, is how to create small-scale sovereignty. So on that, I'm in agreement, and I think that probably leads to why I'm in agreement with so many of the ways that he looks at different topics. I think that a way we could distinguish these two perspectives is as masculine versus feminine in terms of how to organize societies. To the masculine, I think bigger is better. And in my book, I say bigger is better for empire, but smaller supports sovereignty. If I look at this as a masculine view of hierarchy and of putting people in place who we think will do a better job because we agree with them about how to organize things, that to me is a very masculine perspective. Whereas centering your communities as having as much power as possible over themselves, their own labor, their own resources, their own education, their own ways of doing things, that is a very feminine way, I believe, of organizing. I am a real fan of Matt Ehret and his wife Cynthia Chung, and I've done an episode on them that I'll link at the end called Geopuzzle Pros. I think that they are doing an amazing job of educating people about what the histories of secret societies are and all of the different psyops that have been enacted on us throughout the ages, particularly centering around London and how the UK and royalty have come into that. And that's another topic that both he and James Corbett share. They've both done really interesting episodes on the latest coronation. Yet there are places where I've respectfully disagreed with Matt in his comment threads, and he has answered to those. So we've had some really interesting dialogues, and it caused him to be interested in getting my book. So I sent a copy to him and Cynthia, and he replied that my introduction was, he thought, the best example of Platonic thinking that he had seen. So that's something that has been really fun, to have someone of their caliber looking at my ideas and examining them. Yet some of those disagreements go back to my book. Matt, for instance, is a real fan of Hamilton, and he sometimes refers to the Hamilton-Franklin plan of creating money through government. Now, I'm all for that, but that's not what Hamilton did. That's what Benjamin Franklin did before the Revolutionary War. And that was how he created these communities that were very self-sufficient, that were able to create their own produce. And so my entire book is really based around Franklin's model. I take his model and I adapt it to how we could make that happen now. But it is the opposite of Hamilton. What Hamilton did was come in and put the U.S. in debt to the French, in debt to the bankers. And that's something that we never have recovered from. So I think that we need to be clear about whose economic system we're promoting. And to go to the heart of the matter, if you believe in self-governance, it's just not possible as one of a billion people. You may have great development projects, and you may have someone benevolent who gives you a higher quality of life, particularly if you don't happen to be one of the producers. But you don't have any ability to really decide what kind of government you want and what kind of policies you want. So I think that that needs to be clarified, that anyone who sees the right size for self-governance or for sovereignty being at a billion people or more doesn't really believe in that concept. And as I said in my interview with Jeff Brown, who I met through Matt Ehret's Substack, that if China has a trade imbalance and is exporting more than they're importing, that means that it's not doing anything good for their people. That if they were to take the things they're exporting and create those for their own population and not have more money coming in, which is not going to those same people, they would be producing more for their own population. That's just logical. Instead, I think that we need to be cautious about what's going to happen with all the treasury bills that China is amassing at a point where the petrodollar becomes next to worthless. The thing that those dollars will still buy is real estate. And if we don't want to have our real estate be bought up by China, I think we need to have a plan for how to protect it. Another area where Matt and I have disagreed is that he believes that Trump is going to be able to fix things, that Trump had policies, even though he had problems, but his policies were ones that would have created a stronger economy. I don't necessarily disagree with that, but my position is that I think that Trump was the great setup to the Great Reset, that we would never have been able to have people turn against those policies that they used to be for, particularly liberals, if we hadn't had something that we pushed back against, and so much of that was because of his personal style, which was offensive. So I think that that is something that has put us in the place that we're at now, and that the 4 years of being in office did not change any of those policies, didn't enact any of those policies. I feel that it's naive to think that another 4 years would then do the trick. And last, which is really just an aside, I posted on my last episode about C.S. Lewis and his belief that women don't belong in the world of ideas. Now, Matt writes a lot about C.S. Lewis and is a big fan, and I just can't imagine how anyone who is married to Cynthia Chung can possibly respect Lewis's ideas on women, because she is brilliant. Cynthia is not just a great historian, but she also is someone who puts together all of the different pieces and has a really interesting perspective. So I think that the C.S. Lewis also has been part of the religious component with them. And I think of Judeo-Christianity as being another hierarchy, another masculine way in which there is power and bigger is better, and there is a lot of influence. I was a huge fan when I was a kid of the Chronicles of Narnia. I thought they were amazing. And then when they came out with the movie, I took my kids to see it, and I was horrified. I just had never imagined all the ways in which other races and other religions, like the Muslims, were being pictured as not even human, and how much the manifest destiny of Christianity, and particularly the Catholics and the Church, was a huge part of that. The divine right of kings, the monopoly of power, the ability to just rule and take the earth for yourself because you're the one who really has morals and ethics. I just don't know how anyone can look at the history of conquest and colonization and still believe that. Now let's look at James Corbett. In a previous episode, I talked about his documentary Hopium that talks about Obama, among others. Now, I had a pirate radio show during the time that Obama first came into office, and I had episodes like the Inauguraforia, where everyone was seeing this as the savior. I also, during that time, had a 6-foot banner that was over my front door for years that said, "Torture is wrong." During that time, since I lived between the middle school and the high school, my middle daughter told everyone that she lived around the corner. But then, during Obama's campaign, my neighbor across the street put up a huge banner saying, "Hope and Change." And so we had the Battle of the Banners, and sadly, mine won. That the inauguration came and went, and Obama said the first thing he would do was to close Guantanamo, and it is still open to this day. So I think that that's a major area where James and I agree. In an episode I was just listening to, James was talking about the decentralization of information related to universities and how you need to be a part of those universities in order to access all of these things that have been created with public money. And then he mentioned Aaron Swartz, and my eyes filled with tears. I was so happy that he was remembering Aaron Swartz. I did an episode on Aaron way back when I had my radio show, and what he had done was take thousands of documents from JSTOR, and in this guerrilla information movement had made them available had downloaded them and then had put them out there so that anyone could access them. Because why wouldn't we want to be sharing as much information as we have? And even though JSTOR decided not to prosecute him, the administration, and I'm wondering whether it was Obama at the time, decided to make an example of him. And weeks before his trial, where he stood to perhaps get sentenced to 35 years in prison and millions of dollars, he committed suicide. I think that Aaron is another hero who's up there with Julian Assange, and it just did my heart good to have James talk about him. And I'll end with the last example of a place where I'm not sure if I agree or disagree with James, which is on whether Russia is a part of the Great Reset and whether Putin is just being set up as someone who is going to make this happen in a way that looks as if there's opposition, but in the end bundles it all up and hands it to the World Economic Forum. One thing that he has talked about is that he doesn't necessarily think that Sy Hersh has it right about the U.S. blowing up the Nord Streams. It's hard for me to imagine any other scenario that makes sense on that. There's no reason that Russia would do that to themselves and would cut off Europe themselves. But instead, I think that perhaps China has set up Biden in order to do that because it does benefit them. And keeping this whole Ukraine fiasco going is something that protects them, because the more that we fight them there, the more we are running out of weapons and ammunition and perhaps the will to keep going. And in another aside, James did an episode on TSA as obedience training, and I'm here to tell you, he stole that phrase from me. Of course, he stole it several years before I came up with it, but whatever. And to follow up on this, I recommend Matt Ehret and Cynthia Chung, Geopuzzle Pros, and also James Corbett on Hopium and Heroes. Thanks for watching.